transfer as
Oh,
an
you
interviewing
did,
a
yeah.
social worker, interviewing the husband and wife.
Yeah.
All right, group, thanks for waiting the extra 4 minutes while I set everything up. I appreciate it. Today we're going to be going through chapter 20. And if you're looking ahead, we do have an exam a week from today. So Monday will be a review session. It'll be in person because I'll be here this time. And we'll come in on Monday. It'll be informal. I won't have anything prepared. We can go through the study guide if you'd like to, but bring questions. You know, if you say, hey, review a certain topic, I'll be like, cool, and then I'll do it. But you guys are going to kind of lead that review session, and I'll help guide you guys in that direction. And we can talk about the exam either on Monday or at the end of class today, whatever you guys prefer. Depends how fast you want to get out of here, right? Because knowing you guys, you'll pack up about like on the last slide. And then, because you can all see which slide number we're on, right? Because it's on the bottom right-hand corner. It's like last slide, I hear the like the zippers and the books are closed. Okay. So today we're talking about chapter 20. It's talking about cancer cells, okay? Preface this with, I am not a cancer expert, right? But I do know a little bit about what happens with these different cancer cells. I know about some different types of diseases that can happen because of cancer cells or some complications, but by no means am I I think it's called an oncologist. There's some real experts out there, but then there's me, right? I'm a geneticist. But cancer cells are really interesting because mostly all of us, whether it's we know a friend or a family member, has been affected by cancer in some way. So it tends to kind of be like an interesting topic. In a sense, it's like you can kind of relate to it, whether that be personally or through somebody else that you know. We're going to talk about the characteristics of cancer cells. So being able to be like, okay, what's the difference between a cancer cell and a regular cell? There's some stages of development of cancer that you maybe heard of before. Angiogenesis and metastasis. Those are two words we're going to discuss. We have proto-oncogenes and tumor suppressor genes. These are also some words that, while right now they look really big and scary, we will be talking about them. There's also some things we'll talk about with kind of identifying maybe if somebody should go get checked for cancer complications, and also, which is kind of stands for caution. There's also some screening tests that can be, you can do yourself at home to help kind of test your awareness if you have cancer in certain areas or organs. We'll talk about some of the standard and newer treatments of cancer. So when I say standard and newer, obviously through, no problem. The newer cancer therapies that are coming out, there's probably some that I don't even know about. And then there's some standard ones that maybe a lot of us kind of are familiar with. And then there'll be a question like, what is your opinion on controlling tobacco and things like that? Okay, so here's a little bit about some characteristics of cancer cells. They lack differentiation and do not contribute to body functioning, okay? Our regular cells have some differentiation because, like, your liver cells are different than your kidney cells, and your skin cells are different than your fat cells, okay? All of those have specific functions. All of those cells have specific functions. Cancer cells are pretty much just cancer cells, and they don't help your body in any way. They don't contribute to a body function. Sometimes they get in the way. Sometimes they are dividing uncontrollably. Sometimes they're lacking or getting in the way of, or even just their shape is preventing some other function from happening, okay? They have abnormal nuclei that are enlarged and may have an abnormal number of chromosomes, okay? So think about our cells. We know there's a nucleus on the inside. So these cancer cells, a little bit abnormal looking on the inside of the cell. And because of that, and probably before that, it's the chromosomes and the DNA that made up that cancer cell that are kind of making it go haywire, another way to say that. It has an unlimited ability to divide. One way is through on the telomerase. So telomerase is an enzyme, and there's a gene that is tells when to build a cell, but these are continually being built, thus allowing a cell to divide over and over again. So remember when we were talking about that cell cycle and we had all those checkpoints, like the security in the airport? Essentially, the cancer cell is like, what is it called? Global something, where they just get to go straight through. What is it called at the airport? Global entry. Is that global, or clear, or something, clear blue, wherever they just kind of get to skip all those security lines and they just get it go through, and they're dividing rapidly and kind of uncontrollably, which is not good, right? We have certain checkpoints in our cell cycle when we want to grow a new cell that are like, okay, has this happened? Okay, has this happened? And now the cancer cell is kind of like cell gone wild, right? It's just uncontrollable, dividing. It's not dividing properly, which is why there's an abnormal nuclei and there's a different number of chromosomes, just because it's different. It's not controlled. These then can form tumors, these cancer kind of clumps, these cancer cell clumps. You've maybe heard of something called a benign tumor. These are usually encapsulated and they do not invade the adjacent tissue. While cancerous tumor, it's usually not encapsulated and eventually invades surrounding tissue. So this one, the first one, that benign tumor, it's kind of just sitting there. It's not invading another tissue. It can get in the way of things. It can be a nuisance, but a cancerous tumor is usually not encapsulated and eventually invades the surrounding tissue. You maybe heard, oh, the person had cancer and then it moved to their lungs. Okay, that would be a cancerous tumor because it moved and invaded into that other tissue. Where a benign tumor is kind of just like an unwanted little, I guess little is subjective, but something that is in your body that can cause some maybe pain, irritation, may get in the way of other bodily functions, but it's not cancerous. It's not moving to your lungs or into your blood or anything like that. It can divide without growth factors. So we talked about that a little bit. Cancer cells are dividing. They're kind of doing what they want. It can become abnormal gradually through a multi-stage process. It can also undergo angiogenesis and metastasis. So let's talk a little bit about the 3 phases of development of a cancer cell. Luckily for us, the 3 bolded words kind of make sense in the order. Initiation, when you initiate something, it's kind of the beginning. When you get promoted in a job, maybe you're kind of moving your way up. And then progression, or like Progressive Insurance or something, right? When there's a progression, there's a journey and things like that. So your initiation is when a single cell undergoes a mutation that causes it to divide repeatedly. A mutation is the change in the genetic code. All right, let me write that down. Let's get some chalk. Okay, a mutation equals a change in gene code. And we've talked about a few types of mutations before. We've talked about, I think it might have been last class period or the class period before that, deletion. We've talked about insertion. Talked about inversion. And translocation. Okay, these are different types of mutations. Okay, so a deletion would be if your normal code looks something like this, totally random. A mutation would be when the cell grows and divides and wants to make a new one. It accidentally deleted an A. Which kind of matters because remember when we would go through and we'd pick the 3, let's just say that's like this, and those make up those amino acids, and we look at that chart that you go A is in the first stage, and then T, and then G, and that makes a certain amino acid. So if you delete a letter, it could change the amino acid in the strand that makes your protein. It doesn't have to. I mean, you guys have mutations probably in your body that you don't even know about that don't affect it, because sometimes changing one letter doesn't change the amino acid, but it could, which changes the function. Maybe that one function would be the growth factor or something like that. Another way is insertion. So if you have ATC, if this is your original code and you grow and divide, maybe we just added a T and made it 3 T's in a row. We just inserted another letter just because of a mistake, a change in the gene code. Inversion would be like if we had A, T, C, G, whatever. Maybe when we went to grow and divide, we just flipped these two. And now it's G, C, T, C, T, T, A, T, G. Okay, I flipped these two. They were just inverted. You can also just invert one letter too, not necessarily 3. And then translocation would be just like completely moving it. We saw that example where you had chromosomes like this, and maybe there was a part right here that looked like that. And when we go to grow and divide, maybe we added this to the other side. You see how this changed to the other side, just translocating it to the other side. Okay, so these are some different mutations. Change in a gene code, something's going off here when they're going to grow and divide and make new cells. So a single cell undergoes one of these mutations and it causes that cell to just start dividing repeatedly, uncontrollably. A promotion is when the tumor develops and the cells within the tumor start to mutate. And we'll show a picture here in the next slide. Good. Progression, a cell mutates in such a way that it allows it to invade the surrounding tissue. Okay, so this is kind of on the molecular level where the letters are being changed. Okay, promotion is now that we've started to grow and divide and now we created a tumor. This is really small change. Tumor is something 3D now that we can probably see with an X-ray or a microscope. And then progression is when it starts to invade the surrounding tissues. All right, here's the 3 phases in the development of I almost said skin cancer, but I guess it could be skin cancer, but the development of cancer cells. All right, that first picture there, there's a cell right here that looks a little bit different than the other cells. This is a cell that went through a mutation. It's a little bit different. Something happened that it's a little bit off, okay? That one cell then grows and divides into 2 new cells. And then those 2 new cells grow and divide into 2 new cells. And now we're multiplying exponentially, meaning it's doubling. And the new mutations arise, and this kind of brown cell has the ability to start a tumor. And now we're making all of these kind of bad cells. As you can see, the cells have gained the ability to invade the underlying tissue. So now they're not just in that top layer, they're invading this tissue below. As you can see, they're starting to invade that tissue. A malignant tumor, cancer cells now have the ability to invade the lymphatic and blood vessels. So we've invaded that tissue, and now we're getting into the blood vessels. And when we get into the blood vessels, we know that the blood vessels help transport things throughout our body. So now they're transporting these cancer cells throughout our body, and which could invade other cells, other tissues, okay? Now, we have a metastatic tumor where they are found they come from a distance and from the original tumor. So if the original tumor was happening here, we kind of hit the bloodstream, whether that's the lymphatic vessels or the blood vessels, arteries or veins. And because that cancer cell kind of traveled through the blood vessels, it can invade other areas and tissues. So those words I keep saying a little bit are the angiogenesis and metastasis. Angiogenesis is the formation of new blood vessels to supply nutrients and oxygen to the tumor. Okay, it's kind of like the tumor is a foreign substance, but our body recognizes it in a way and gives it blood and oxygen. Which you're like, come on, body, like, what are you doing? You should figure that out. That's a tumor. That's not good. It's going to cause us some complications. So angiogenesis is where your body kind of gives the tumor blood vessels and oxygen and allows it to continue to kind of grow. Metastasis occurs when the cells move into the bloodstream. That was that kind of those last couple of pictures on the last slide, where you can think of it as like kind of what would happen with COVID, essentially, right? We kind of shut down some of the airlines there for a little bit to prevent travel. We'll think of it as like the cancer cells getting on an airplane and going somewhere else. So there's a little bit of a genetic basis for cancer. This first gene, the proto-oncogene, which is kind of hard to say, produces and promotes the cell cycle and prevents cell death, apoptosis. So this gene promotes that cell cycle. It promotes cells to continue to divide, and it prevents apoptosis. There's also another gene in our body called the tumor suppressant gene, and this is what inhibits cell growth and promotes apoptosis. So the proto-oncogene and the tumor suppressor gene are kind of opposites to each other. Mutations in these genes can cause cancer. And in fact, the proto-oncogenes that have mutated are cancer-causing genes called oncogenes. Sorry, I had to make sure I said that right in my head. And then that's why somebody who is maybe a cancer doctor is called an oncologist. It's kind of seeing how all those words go together. So oncogenes, proto-oncogene is the one that promotes the cell cycle. The cancer-causing genes are called oncogenes, and then if you are a cancer doctor, you're called an oncologist. Okay. What you're thinking is, we know a lot about genetics now. Could we look into somebody's genetic code and see what's going on with these genes? Definitely. So mutations in the proto-oncogenes produce these oncogenes that stimulate the cell cycle. So here, this kind of orange protein that's in the receptor here, it has a stimulating growth factor. It creates a signaling pathway. So what a signaling pathway is kind of like a telephone game that you maybe played at summer camp with your friends, right? Or I guess you can play it now too. It's not probably a COVID safe game, but you whisper in somebody's ear and you say a phrase like, the sky is blue. And then the next person has to say, the sky is blue. That's a signaling pathway. So because this stimulating growth factor kind of landed in that receptor, it kind of communicated through the chains, all right? And it's changing the DNA. So here's the nucleus down here. Here is your DNA, those blue ribbon looking things. And this is like part of your oncogene. And then this right here is a transcription factor. What ends up happening is that protein then overstimulates the cell cycle. So it's sending a message that says, hey, grow and divide really rapidly and uncontrollably. And that's what's happening here. The tumor suppressor gene, okay, in our bodies works right now to suppress tumor genes, okay? It causes a loss of the cell cycle control. So this is an inhibiting growth factor that ends up on this receptor. Now we're sending a new message that says, hey, quit growing. And then they kind of communicate down, changes the DNA, which changes the proteins that are unable to inhibit the cell cycle or promote apoptosis. Okay, so now we just can't kind of stop or kill the cells. So they kind of work hand in hand. You've probably heard of some different types of cancer. Okay, maybe you're more familiar with others. Carcinomas is cancer of the epithelial tissue. We know what epithelial tissue is because we've talked about different types of tissue. You have muscle tissue, nervous tissue, connective tissue, and epithelial tissue. Some common ones of the epithelial tissue are colon cancer, some types of breast cancer, okay? This is kind of that like I said, that epithelial tissue. Think of it like your skin, things that kind of turn over very quickly. When I say turn over very quickly, the cells are regenerating rapidly. So like I said, every 2 weeks, every month or so, those new cells are happening. When there's a lot of cell turnover, that's where cancer can be more prominent. Okay, I'm going to try and say this right. Adenocarcinomas, cancer of the glandular epithelial tissue. So these are the glands in your epithelial tissue, so like your mammary gland. Sarcoidomas, this is cancer of the muscle and connective tissue. Leukemia is cancer of the blood, and lymphomas is cancers of the lymphatic tissue. Okay, I have a little video for us to watch. So I went to Denver High School, which is kind of just down the road, a little bit that way, 15 minutes. And my high school was really big on wrestling, because in Iowa, it's like a wrestling thing. And I had a friend who went and wrestled at Iowa. Let's see if it pulls up here. There we go. Let's see here. I had a friend who wrestled at Iowa. So we're the same age. He was an All-American at Iowa, so that means that you get in the top 10, I believe, at the national tournament. And he was recently, when I say recently, diagnosed with leukemia. So let's watch this.
When your back's against the wall, that's when you got to be at your best. In honor of and tribute in support of Brandon Swords, recently diagnosed with cancer. Brandon Swords was a four-time All-American. He's a fan favorite. He was a staple in that lineup. Swords and strong bandanas, great support for a great competitor.
Brandon's story, it'll be a success story, and I know he plans to use whatever he can to help others going through the same situation.
My family lives in Cedar Falls, so it's about an hour and a half away. Brandon, he stayed around and wrestled for Hawkeye Wrestling Club, so he was always down here training.
He had been sick the week of Thanksgiving, and his girlfriend happened to be up for our Thanksgiving dinner and was talking to us, and she goes, you know, he's really sick.
By Friday, he texted me again and said he was going to the emergency room. I couldn't sleep that night. Brandon was up at 3 a.m. texting me and asking me where I was at, so I got on the road. The doctor came in and said, are Brandon's parents here? Are they coming? And that's when it kind of like hit me that something was kind of more wrong than what we thought.
I was thinking like infection from an adverse appendix, or he needed surgery or something like that. We go in the hospital, and as soon as we get there, the doctor came in, and he didn't mince any words. He said, I gotta tell you, we're looking at lymphoma or leukemia here. There's something wrong with his blood. But I gotta let you know, it's looking pretty drastic, basically.
Brandon's diagnosis is acute lymphoblastic leukemia. He has cancer in his blood. His family is strong. They don't really show emotion. We were all just kind of there together in shock. He had a lot of emotions and a lot of bad emotions. I mean, he was in a scary place. The Wisconsin duel, we kind of watched it on TV, and it was just us two in there, and I kind of looked at him and I said, this is like terrible. And he looked at me and he said, I'm not there yet, I just got to get better. So, sorry. So he knew that he had to get better. it's been a balance between the two.
I know somebody said, why don't you put a current bridge out or you put updates and how things say, you know, they want to hear an update. And Brandon's like, just tell them I'm going to get better. That's all they need to know.
Brody Matter, it's just about, here's what you got going for you. And there's 12 spots. And I filled out 8 of them. And you fill out the rest because the list keeps going, the great assets that you have. And that's what's going to get you through it. This isn't about, you know, who's worried about him and who loves him. This is about him and his fight and putting everything into this.
When he was in the hospital, definitely the whole team, they like took their turns just being with Brayden, so he wasn't alone.
We had to sign in every time we went to the hospital. And every time we signed in, there were 2 or 3 from the Iowa team that signed in before us. Almost every day, even on Christmas Day, when somebody came by. For the GoFundMe page, it was kind of a conversation back and forth with Tom Brands. We don't know about doing that. And he's like, yeah, but you don't understand. They're going to show up at your doorstep and help you if you don't give them an avenue to help you. T-shirts are being made, and all of a sudden we saw a post on Facebook, they're being sold at this tournament. All the proceeds are going to go to the family. We're like, oh, that's really nice.
I read the GoFundMe comments. A lot of them made me cry. I read some of them to Brandon even. So many prayers going out for him, knowing that. Goodness, I'm gonna cry. I'm trying really hard not to. He doesn't have a full-time career job lined up, and he can't work the next few years with the chemo treatments. So the money is just huge with paying the medical bills, all of that stuff. We don't have to stress about anything really, except him getting better.
It's a long road. It's a 3-year protocol, is what they said. You just got to go on, and this is our new normal, but it's kind of hard to accept that.
It is curable, so, I mean, it is a good one to have if you were to have cancer, just because it is curable and he can get through it.
He is the most positive person I've ever met. So, and that's the only side of him I think that there is.
In 4 decades of announcing, I don't know of anyone that's ever impressed me more than Brandon Sorensen. The way he put it out there, he kind of went to the man.
We watched the duel on TV. It was fun. We couldn't be here for it. I mean, even though we weren't here, we could feel the love and support from everyone. I think he secretly loved it. Brandon, he can't beat cancer in a day, but he will beat it.
All right, so that was just a little kind of bring it to a current event. So that was last fall. So his girlfriend and him went to my high school, and then so Brandon was a 4-time All-American in Iowa. So it just shows you that cancer does not discriminate, even though you're an elite athlete or healthiest person in the world. All right, so let's talk about what can cause cancer. Genetics seems to be one of the easiest answers to cancer because, like I just showed here, if we get something off in your code or your genetics, it can cause some things to go wrong. So that makes sense. Also, different types of cancers can be prominent in like family lines. So if you've had a family member that had a certain type of cancer, sometimes it's an okay thing to do is go get checked on your genetics in that area. One of them I'm thinking of is like the breast cancer gene. It can also happen from environmental carcinogens. So somebody who works in the area of radiation a lot has to be kind of concerned or aware of the amount of radiation that they are kind of exposing their bodies to because it can cause cancer. Environmental, so like tobacco smoke and pollutants. Luckily in Iowa, we don't have a lot of air pollutants. We have a lot of open spaces. But is anybody maybe from like a little bit more denser population? Maybe not in Iowa? Yeah.
I was just gonna say I'm from Cedar Rapids.
Cedar Rapids definitely has some like air pollutants, definitely from the factories. They call it the 5 seasons, right? 5 seasons, yeah.
Pittsburgh is bad because of all the steel mills.
Mm-hmm.
So the area I grew, well, I live in the country, but closer to Pittsburgh is pretty bad for that.
Yeah, definitely. Anybody else have an example? Thinking of like LA, Los Angeles, overpopulated, yeah.
Chicago has a lot of city south and factories too.
Yep, definitely Chicago, those big cities, lots of factories, lots of businesses. Did you have one too?
Oh, I just know the place, but I don't live there.
Yeah.
So in Singapore, where I used to live,
Mhm.
they have, they burn the palm oil tree
Mm-hmm.
for seasonal, and like usually the haze comes from Indonesia, and then it will carry out the smoke to Singapore as well.
Yeah, definitely. So when what did you say they were burning?
The palm tree.
Oh, the palm tree. Got it. Yes. So as you guys know, there can be some environmental things, pollution in the air. Those are good examples. Also viruses can cause cancer. So what viruses do, and we haven't talked a lot about viruses yet in this class, but we will. Viruses are unique to individuals. They're not a bacterial infection. So a bacteria infection is like if you go and you have an earache and you go to the doctor and then they give you an antibiotic. We probably, almost all of us, have had an antibiotic at some point because doctors like to lean on those. But what an antibiotic does is it kills the bacteria. A virus invades the person's body and changes and kind of gets into their DNA. And because everybody's DNA is different, after it gets into that cell and that cell is growing and dividing, that virus is unique to the individual. So it's also why you can't just go to the store, go to Walgreens down the street and get something that'll cure your virus. It's also the problem that we kind of have right now, right? We don't have a cure to COVID-19, but we have things like a vaccine or some things that'll help your symptoms. So if you've ever had the flu, there's no cure to the flu. It can be kind of not detrimental, but kind of a really big inconvenience. Charlie's like, yeah. I know some friends who've had the flu, but you can go to Walgreens and get some things that'll help your symptoms. Like you can take an ibuprofen or you can take a cough suppressor, things like that. Those will just help your symptoms, but it won't cure the actual source. Where an antibiotic kills the actual source. It kills that bacteria. So these viruses, they get into your cell, they get into your DNA, and if they change things enough, it could cause cancer. Still definitely a newer type of kind of discovery. So what this picture here is showing, it's figure 20.5 in your book. It's just showing the difference between males and females and what types of cancer are more prominent. It's kind of hard to see up here on the board, so I definitely recommend looking in your book. But these are the estimated causes of cancer and cancer deaths. So the top two, it's a male and a female. The top, or essentially the most common cancer in males, is prostate cancer. The most common cancer in females is breast cancer. Okay, that makes sense. Some of the ones that come down after that, both male and females have lung and bronchitis cancer in second place, colon and rectum cancer in the next place there, urinary bladder, yeah, thank you. A couple other ones, that's a good one that you'll maybe want to look at on your own. But what's important about this description is there's a difference between the cancer that's the most common and the cancer that's more deadly, okay? So the one that causes the most deaths in males is the lung and the bronchitis cancer that gets into their lung system. That one can be more detrimental. And also in females, the lung and bronchitis, whereas as you can see, prostate and breast cancer are then second most deadly. So although prostate and breast cancer are more prominent, more common cancers to have, the lung and bronchitis are the more deadly. So some genetics can cause cancer. So the BRCA1 or the BRCA gene is the one we talked about in lab a little bit a couple of days ago. These are tumor suppressor genes that are associated with breast cancer. So when some family lines maybe have a common kind of tie to breast cancer, some people will get tested for this, have a genetic test for this gene, okay? Having the BRCA1 or the BRCA2 gene does not mean that you will have breast cancer. It just means that you probably have a high probability of having breast cancer. So what this does is, remember those tumor suppressor genes and those proto-oncogenes? Having this one, it's not able to essentially promote apoptosis. The RB gene, so all of these kind of orangish red letters are the different genes. The RB is a tumor suppressant gene that is associated with eye tumors. And the RET is a proto-oncogene that is associated with thyroid cancer. So these are different genes that through research, people have found that have an association with kind of a probability of having cancer. So if you have a mutation or a kind of one of these, remember that happens in one of those genes, it can cause certain cancers. It takes at least one or more of these acquired mutations during their lifetime to develop cancer. So like it says, it doesn't tell the whole story. It does take mutation in those genes to actually kind of have the cancer. Just because you have one of these genes or that gene is expressed does not necessarily mean that you have cancer. Transposons, these are called jumping genes. And when I see the word jumping genes, I think of like jumping beans or jelly beans or things like that. These are small mobile sequences of DNA that have the ability to move throughout the genome and sometimes cause mutations. So these are kind of like translocation, but they're jumping a little bit further than on the same chromosome, okay? So if a transposon that causes the loss of a cell cycle control happens, so if there's a transposon and it jumps to the gene where we kind of control the cell cycle, those security checkpoints, it can cause cancer. Some other environmental causes, we talked about radiation. So this is such as UV light in like the sun or tanning beds and X-rays. Okay, that's why sunscreen is really important. Okay, I wear sunscreen every day in my like lotion that I use on my face. It's really important because what UV light does is essentially it can damage your skin cells, which is why some people, when they go outside, they get sunburnt. And what sunburnt means is essentially is that top layer of skin is damaged. What's really cool about our body is that we're not sunburnt forever, right? And maybe some people are more susceptible to that than others, but you're not sunburnt forever. Sometimes it like peels off, but what really is happening is that your cells are regenerating and fixing themselves, okay? And sometimes when you're sunburnt, you want your cells to kind of fix themselves pretty quickly. But like I said, when there's a lot of cell turnover, or essentially like in your skin cells, in your colon, in your breast tissues, that's where we kind of see if there's more turnover, there's more opportunities for mistakes. Which is, so it's not saying that you go outside and get sunburnt once you're gonna get skin cancer. That's not what's happening. It's saying that if you're frequently exposed to UV light, your skin is having to kind of correct that damage, and it gives it the opportunity to have some sort of mistake. And we'll talk a little bit about skin cancer as well. Some organic chemicals, so tobacco smoke increases cancer of the lungs, mouth, larynx, and others. At one point, we didn't know that, right? There was a time in the 50s, the 60s when smoking and tobacco products were encouraged. And now we know a little bit more about that it can cause cancer in the lungs. When I was in my undergrad, I took anatomy and physiology with a real cadaver. So if you don't know what a cadaver is, it's a donated human body that is donated to science. And you use it to kind of go through the different anatomical parts of the body and the cadaver that we had happened to have been a smoker. So the lungs were the color of this owl. They were pretty dark in color, kind of like a charcoal, which kind of makes sense, right? If you've got you want your lungs to be kind of that like pinkish color that you think of when you think of a picture of your lungs. And so if there's a little bit of damage to them, it can cause, so like I said, your body's trying to fix that mistake, and it can cause some mistakes and mutations and things like that. Other things such as metals, dust, and chemicals, kind of like what we were talking about up here with Pittsburgh, having that steel factory there. Pesticides can increase the risk of cancer. So the pesticides that are maybe put on crops in Iowa, if there's too much exposure to that, it can also cause cancer. Some of the viruses ones that we were talking about, so the hepatitis B and C viruses can cause liver cancer. The Epstein-Barr virus can cause the Burkitt lymphoma. The human papilloma virus can cause cervical cancer. There's HTLV1, which is the human T-cell lymphotropic virus. Helper T cells help fight off infections. So if you have a virus in this essentially area or this gene, it can cause leukemia. It kind of fights against your body's ability to fight off infections. HIV and the Kaposi sarcoma associated with the KSHV can cause sarcoma and certain lymphomas as well. The difference between leukemia and lymphoma, remember, is leukemia is in the blood, lymphoma is in the lymphatic system. Your lymphatic system helps you fight off infections. So the acronym CAUTION is a way that your book describes some warning signs of cancer, because we don't want that to happen to anyone. If there's a change, that's what the C stands for, in bowel or bladder habits, a sore that does not heal. So maybe that's like identifying a mole or a sore on your arm that maybe changes in color or shape over a short period of time, unusual bleeding or discharge, thickening or a lump in the breast or elsewhere. If you're feeling, like I said, even if you're just feeling your arm and you feel a weird lump in your arm, it's definitely something to go get checked out of. Indigestion or difficulty swallowing, which would make sense, right? If you have cancer or a tumor in your throat area, that's probably going to cause some difficulty swallowing. Obvious change, like I said, in a wart or a mole, or a nagging coughing or hoarseness. A little bit more about detecting skin cancer. I'm sorry if these are a little graphic. I should have warned you first. You have the ABCD. So if you have a mole or a freckle or things like that, or a sore on your hand or arm or things like that, some things that you can look for is if it's asymmetrical. So notice how there's a picture of a penny on that first slide, like a coin, and the kind of the sore or it's possibly skin cancer on the right. It has kind of a bluish brown in color. It also is not symmetrical, whereas like most freckles or things like that are somewhat perfectly round. If the border is irregular, so this one is the next one. It's on a person's hand where you can see there's a middle part, and then the border around it is a little bit different. If the color varies from one area to another, or even if you've noticed the color changing, and if the diameter is larger than 6 millimeters. So 6 millimeters is actually not that big. If you think about what 1 centimeter looks like when we look at a ruler, okay, in real life, this is probably a centimeter, okay, from the end to there. So 6 millimeters would be like about halfway through that small dash, which is hard for you guys to see in the back of the classroom, but it's pretty small. So if something is the diameter, so the measurement across is larger than 6 millimeters. So this is a picture of some mammograms that can detect breast cancer. So this is a breast tissue, and as you can see on the picture B, we have a little bit of some sort of mass. It's highlighted for you, which helps, okay? That could be a tumor in the breast tissue. Something that can prevent or kind of help people keep aware of breast cancer is self-examination, monthly exams of the breasts and the testicles, starting at the age of 20. You've maybe heard of someone you know, or maybe a parent having a colonoscopy every 5 years after the age of 50. So like I said, your colon also is that epithelial, made up of epithelial tissue, lots of cell turnover in your colon as well as your breast tissue, which is why there's a higher risk of cancer in those areas. People over the age of 40 usually have a mammogram, and a Pap test should be 3 years after vaginal intercourse and no later than the age of 21 to test for different cervical cancers and things like that. There's other ways to detect cancer. You can have tumor marker tests. This is a blood test for tumor antigens and antibodies. We know what those two words mean, antibodies, antigens, when we took a little bit more time to describe blood type. Remember, if you have the antibodies for COVID, that means that your body knows how to fight it off. If you have tumor antibodies in your blood, which means your body recognizes that you have a tumor and is trying to fight it. It recognizes it as a foreign substance. So you can take a blood sample to test for the antibodies. The CEA is the carcinoembryonic antigen. This is an antigen that can be detected in someone with colon cancer. So they have identified what that antibody or that antigen looks like. The PSA is not a public service announcement. It's prostate-specific antigen. This tests for prostate cancer. And then the AFP is the alpha fetoprotein, which tests for liver tumors. So these are specific antibodies or antigens in each example that we know what they look like. So if your body is fighting off a tumor that looks like that, these antibodies or antigens would be in your bloodstream. You can have a genetic test, like I said, to test for some of those genes that we listed on a couple of slides ago, like the thyroid cancer gene, the melanoma, or the breast cancer gene, okay? It tests for the mutations in the proto-oncogenes and the tumor suppressor genes. So what would happen is most likely it would be a blood test, and they would identify and extract your DNA, not with Gatorade like we did the other day, but they would extract your DNA, look at it through a DNA sequencer, which would essentially, you'd put the liquid into a machine that can identify the letters, and the letters all come up on the computer screen. And if you have the certain letter in the certain location, it would mean that you have that gene. And it says a diagnosis of cancer can be confirmed by a biopsy. So someone who maybe has like a lump in their breast would have a biopsy, so they would probably get it removed. And then they can identify it by kind of looking at the genes of that tumor. Some ways that we can protect ourselves and prevent cancer as best as possible is not using tobacco products. Okay, you've probably been told that since you were in high school, preventing use of tobacco products. Don't sunbathe or use a tanning booth. All right, if you do go outside, use sunscreen. Avoid radiation. So just, it's mainly for people who like work in an x-ray area of the hospital, or if you have to use that at your job later in life, just being aware if there is radiation. And most places are really good about kind of describing that with signs on the door, wearing lead clothing. So if you've ever had like an x-ray on your ankle before, or maybe you broke a bone in your arm and you had to get an x-ray, usually they cover up some other areas with like a lead, kind of like, it looks like an apron almost. It's kind of like a heavy apron. Does somebody know what I'm talking about? Yeah, maybe. Okay, good. Being tested for cancer, being aware of occupational hazards. So if you go work in a factory later in life or now, just being aware of some of the chemicals that you may be in contact with or what the air quality is like. Being aware of a postmenopausal hormone therapy and getting vaccinated for different viruses can help prevent cancer. Some like lifestyle choices or the right diet. Avoiding obesity, eating plenty of high fiber foods. Does anybody know of a couple of foods that are high in fiber? Spinach, yep.
Isn't it just like any fruit or vegetable?
Yeah, any fruit or vegetable, thinking green beans. Yeah, what else?
Some wheat foods.
Some wheat foods, yep, definitely high in fiber. There's even like Fiber One bars and things like that if you have a sweet tooth. increasing the consumptions of food that are rich in vitamins A and C, which sometimes can be hard in college, right? Because you just want to go to the cafeteria and eat chicken strips and fries, but it's okay to like throw an apple on your plate once in a while. Yeah. An orange. We can do that. Okay. Reduce consumption of salt cured, smoked, and nitrate cured foods. So this would be like your bacons, your jerkies, things like that are like either smoked or salt cured. Include vegetables from the cabbage family in your diet, and drink alcohol in moderation. I heard a giggle out there. Standard cancer treatments. So these are some that you probably would think that would happen, right? So if we have a tumor in our body, you're like, get that thing out, right? That's maybe your first thought, because we're not doctors in here, right? None of us are cancer doctors. So surgery, so like removing that tumor, okay? So the reason that that doesn't always work, right? Because if you're thinking, if you've got a tumor, just take it out. Those cells will come out. Well, it doesn't work, especially if it's already gotten into your bloodstream, because it can kind of relocate itself and go somewhere else and grow and divide. It's possible to not get the whole tumor out and leave some of those cells behind. So while it may be, it can be a do-all, cure-all, and we hope that that's possible. It's also not a one-size-fits-all kind of situation. So I have a grandma who's 96, and she has breast cancer right now, but because she's so old, she's had breast cancer for probably 6 or 7 years. But it's not going to be the thing that would be detrimental to her life. So they're not going to perform surgery on somebody that old, right? So that's kind of the thing that it wouldn't work in that situation. Radiation therapy, this is localized therapy that causes chromosomal breakage and disrupts the cell cycle. So they can kind of hone in on one area and kind of kill the cells in that area through radiation, even though a couple slides ago I told you not to be involved with radiation because it can essentially kill your cells, and then it can cause mutations when your body tries to correct itself. But this is another type of therapy that can kind of disrupt that cell cycle of that tumor and quit it, make sure it can't grow and divide anymore. Chemotherapy seems to be a fairly common one that people talk about in a lot of movies and things like that. This is a drug that treats the whole body, and it kills cancers by damaging the DNA and interfering with the DNA synthesis. This is why people with chemo kind of get a little sick, right? They get weak. They're killing some of the good cells too. That's probably why they have to shave their heads, or they don't have to shave their head, I guess, and the hair would maybe just fall out on their arms and legs and head, right? Those are just choices. It's just what happens. So essentially what chemo does is it's killing those cancer cells, interfering with your DNA, but it can also damage other cells. Bone marrow transplants. This is a transplant of bone marrow from one individual to the other. Your bone marrow is found inside your compact bones. It produces your red blood cells. So if we produce or transport somebody who doesn't have cancer and donates bone marrow from one individual to another, it's a way that we can maybe fight off some cancers in the blood. A little bit newer therapies. So we're comparing some standard therapies on the last slide to some newer, kind of more innovative therapies that have been coming out. One of them is immunotherapy. This is injecting immune cells that are genetically engineered to bear the tumor's antigens. So essentially we're putting something in, it's kind of like we're sending in the troops, right? This is sending some cells in that are made genetically to fight off tumor cells, which is kind of cool, right? They're made in a lab, most likely somewhere. Passive immunotherapy is where the antibodies that are linked to the radioactive isotopes or chemotherapeutic drugs are injected into the body. So this is like a way of going through radiation and chemotherapy without actually going through radioactive isotopes and chemotherapy drugs. That's why it's called passive immunotherapy. That's like that TikTok where it's like, tell me that you go to college without actually telling me that you go to college. This is that, right? This is the passive. It's like kind of walk me through radioactive stuff, but not actually, right? We're kind of giving you through immunotherapy what would happen if you were going through some radioactive or chemotherapy things. The P53 gene, there's a lot of new research coming out about this P53 gene therapy. This is a retrovirus, and in a clinical trial that it's injected into the body where it will infect and kill only tumor cells. So cells that lack P53 are tumor cells. So like your body and this gene therapy can identify whether or not that P53 gene is present. And because of that, it's like, oh, if it doesn't have a P53 gene, it's a tumor and it can attack that area. So that's kind of cool. That's kind of like I think of it as like a sniper kind of thing from a long distance away. Angiogenesis inhibition. This is an angiostain and an endostain that are drugs in clinical trials that appear to inhibit the angiogenesis. Remember, we talked about angiogenesis and metastasis. So this is just some drugs that are in clinical trials that can inhibit the fact that it could get into your bloodstream. Because if we can just kind of lock in that cancer to one area and not get into your bloodstream, it could be somewhat controllable. Here's just a little diagram that's also in your book. 20.12, immunotherapy. This is just showing how the antigen presenting cell are removed from the patient. We then genetically engineer them to have tumor antigens so that your body can then fight them off because we put them back into the body. And because it has that APC present, the antigen to the cytotoxic T cells, they attack the tumor cells. So by inserting these genetically modified cells, they know to fight off this tumor cell, which is pretty impressive if you ask me. Whoever thought of that should have a Nobel Peace Prize or something. Research grants. Okay, what questions do you have about this material today? Yes.
I have a question about the ones that you said were jumping genes.
Yeah.
Whatever that T word is.
Transposon.
I understand the definition, and they can move through. So I guess I just don't understand. So that everybody has those to begin with? Are those specific, like after the gene, after it mutates, does that show up? Or like as I'm sitting here right now, do I have those?
Possibly. So transposons are, it's like a verb kind of. So these are jumping genes. They're small mobile sequences. So like this would be like one of the mistakes. Like I could add it to this list.
Oh, okay.
So transposon, is it O-N? Yes.
Yeah.
O-N. Okay. So you can think of it like, okay, then we just keep going down a whole list of letters, and then we have some more down here. And essentially what could happen is like if these make up some certain gene, having them kind of like jump and like go somewhere that they're not supposed to. So it just changes the coding sequence because they just like jump from one location to the other. What's different about translocation and transposon is translocation is on the same chromosome.
Oh, okay.
I'm just going to put a chroma. And this can happen from one gene to the next. It could jump to another chromosome even. And it's just a mistake that can happen when the cell is growing and dividing.
Okay. That makes more sense.
Good.
Thank you.
Good question. What else can I answer about the material?